My name's David Ainsworth. I'm the business editor here at Devex, and I'm joined by our group editor, Anna Gavel, and by Nazra Ismail, who is the founder of Generative Connections, which is a consultancy helping people in philanthropy and global development. But this week, we're going to be digging as normal into some of the topics that we have in the world of global development. And this week we're kind of looking at a big theme that's emerged in a few of the different pieces that we've discussed this week, which is basically kind of how the environment in which aid happens is changing. We've got some articles looking at how maybe we want to do aid differently, and we'll be talking a bit about the big beautiful bill, which is basically a number of measures from Donald Trump this week, kind of telling us how he'd like the world to be functioning a little bit differently. So, Anna, maybe you could kick us off by just talking a little bit about the article from one of our contributors, Jess Abrahams, this week, talking about how we fix aid, how we're going to do things a little bit differently.
Yeah, I think, the first thing that's really important to note is that the thrust of the article is part of this larger trend of moving forward. US aid is, for better or worse, gone in its past form at least. And now I think that the initial shock and grief have kind of worn out. There's this sense of people trying to figure out what the next steps are and shape what those next steps are, have a say in it and kind of redefine this new era of aid and figure out what's feasible. And I think what's not feasible is directly plugging the gap that the US left behind. So it's going to require some creative thinking. It's going to require out of the box thinking, but also revisiting some, old reforms and ideas that have been floating around for years or even decades. So we're talking private sector investment, domestic resource mobilization, debt, mergers, acquisitions, all that fun stuff. So I think that the article that kind of uses as a hook is the British Foreign Secretary David Lammy's idea to have a conference discussing all of these issues, what's next for development in the fall, which I think is an important idea. It's an important discussion to have, assuming that the Global South is represented in this discussion. But we kind of talked about some of these ideas. I think one that stuck out to me that I think makes perfect sense is narrowing the focus of aid, given that, significantly diminished official development assistance is now the new norm. So, how can traditional aid money go to the most vulnerable, to humanitarian crises, not necessarily middle-income countries, for example, while using these non-aid funds like private sector investment to tackle the long-term development goals? I think that was an interesting one. I think, as just pointed out, expanding the donor base is going to be necessary. So we're talking about new donor countries. We've got some in Spain, for instance, that is increasing aid. Canada, a little bit of a drop off, but also for years has been slightly growing aid. And then you've got wealthy Middle Eastern donors. You've got China. They each come with their own baggage, obviously, and complications. But the pool of funders is going to have to be expanded in some shape or form. And lastly, what I'll just say is that, there were various ideas in the article. I think one of them that was intriguing, but I don't know how realistic it is pooled funds with assessed contributions. I think that would be one of the ideas that the experts mentioned that would be kind of difficult to pull off. So it involves all countries paying into pooled funds that could then be distributed directly to address particular needs like health, climate, education, and humanitarian crises and so forth. To me, the big obstacle to that is donors giving up control. Obviously, they would like to dictate how their money is used. So I think that's an intriguing idea, but realistically, I don't know how realistic it is in the long run. But I think that the article really puts out some interesting points of ways to fundamentally, what we have to do is rethink aid and get creative. But also, this is the push to revisit some of these older ideas that, there's nothing like, what is it? Opportunity in crisis, So I think it raised some interesting points.
It definitely did. And also published this week was an article by Ian Mercy, who's one of our reporters, talking about how African leaders have reacted to this crisis. And in a lot of cases, what we've heard from them is, okay, fair enough. All right, we liked the money that you were sending us, but we were quite angry about the way that it was being distributed. We felt like it wasn't dignified. We were having to give up a lot of control. And if you're not going to give us money anymore, then okay, get stuffed. We'll figure it out. And they talked about basically how they're going to work on mobilizing their domestic resources, taking back control, upping the amount of government spending that's happening there. And also the one thing that they said that they really need from the rest of the world is essentially um, a fair level playing field. They felt that they weren't getting a fair deal on debt and they weren't getting a fair deal on tax, and that was really holding them back. And they said, look, you sort that out. Just we're not asking for preferential treatment. We're just asking for fair treatment. We don't think we're getting it right now. And if you give us that, we'll stand on our own 2 feet and we won't like, okay, don't give us aid then. Don't give it. That's fine. Um, and I think there was maybe a bit of bravado in that, if for at least from some countries, but it's also a very understandable reaction, I think. As all of this creates a picture of how the aid environment might look quite different going forward. Nasra, you've read these pieces. Let me come to you and kind of tell us what stood out to you. How did you feel about this?
Yeah, no, I appreciate I think this continuation. I think Anna, you're right. There's nothing new here, if you will. These have been continuing reforms, continued sort of fight around not just the support and not just trade and not just policy, but about how things are done, about how aid, if you could even call it that these days, about how collaborations happens across the world. And so I think there's just similar veins of conversations that we've been having. I know, at least for me, we've been having this conversation at Devex for, a better part of my career. But I think this shift towards rebalancing the type of support, whether it's better and more fair, more just policies that not just put trade in the picture, but put trade at the right level for the right countries. There are countries that you could have all the trade policies that are favorable to them, but if they don't have materials, if they're not if they're not able to take advantage of it, what's the point? You're kind of talking to an empty sort of vessel there. But I think if you can balance it, and I think we've been carrying that conversations for many, many years, even with USAID, what we come back to are two things. It's the principles around collaboration. Are these reparative in countries where perhaps our history as a colonizer really did not do them a great favor, and they're still working themselves out of just decades and decades of harm? And then for those countries that are more ready, are more developmentally progressive, how can they now put a little bit more power and be at the table? I know there's also notes coming out of BRICS and what they're able to do around climate refinancing, but the same lesson continues to come through. It's not charity, it's reparative. And if not reparative, then at the very least, it's making sure that the global south is much more coordinated, that they themselves can have a bigger political negotiating power at the table. And so in some ways, I'm not surprised about what we're seeing, but I am keenly, keenly aware and looking forward to seeing how the debates continue over the next few years. I'm excited that there's a new leader. We're seeing a leadership change at African Development Bank and many other major policy groups. So I'm cautious, but I'm slightly optimistic despite what is happening in the sector writ large.
Yeah. If I could just jump in, I think what's interesting is that it's a wide-ranging conversation, and you're talking both internal and external forces. Domestic resource mobilization is really, it's always been in the conversation, obviously, but you really, again, you're forced into having that conversation, raising taxes at home. Obviously, very politically fraught conversation to have, that leads to a lot of backlash here in the US. Doesn't matter what country that could be, but a critical conversation to have. And then you have to also, in any transition, discuss these outside external forces that are playing a role in holding countries back, specifically. Again, the article talks about private sector investment where the risk perception doesn't always match reality on the ground in a lot of these countries. Trade, not aid is simple, but sometimes overly simplified when you have tariff and non-tariff barriers that Western countries put up. And obviously the US is very much in an isolation mode under President Trump. So yeah, I think it's it's interesting to be addressing kind of both sides of the coin to me, and addressing head on this issue of dependence, and the aid trap, and how has it developed over the decades. I do think one important caveat is that any transition should not be so sudden or abrupt. There needs to be a genuine transition, not a cutting off of funds overnight, because that does have life or death repercussions. I think there needs to be assistance to have that transition. You have to have both parties willing to really make, a true transition to aid empowerment, and then to trade, not aid, to private sector investment, domestic resource mobilization, etc. So that would be kind of my one caveat, is that this is not going to happen overnight.
No. And can I say, I mean, the on the prioritization of just even where that aid that has been flowing for some time, even with its inadequacy, even though it was not perfect, there's at least most of my worries are in health and education, which has been systems that have not always generated, or have been ones where the country can rely on its domestic revenue. And so what do we do when health and education sectors that have perhaps not always been supported to its full extent at the country level, when there's a gap like USAID? These are programs that are almost always supporting vulnerable communities, women, mothers, and elderly, young people, people who are disabled, people who are dealing with all kinds of health issues. And so while I know that philanthropy may not be able to actually fill all that gap, it goes to this point of being super careful about how we refinance, super careful about the prioritization of which then systems do we support. But health systems and education systems are by far where I have most of my worries focused on. And I think many people do as well.
Yeah, for sure. I think we see basically that the United States is kind of indicating it's really not interested in whether it's fair and just, and doing a good job of supporting people. And I think we're seeing with European donors, they're saying we want to spend less, we want to pull away, we want to pull back. They have at least done it in a way where people have had sufficient warning that they're able to adapt. And I think this is what's made people particularly angry in this environment. Another thing that I found interesting was the kind of the African countries looking at working together and building strength, kind of coming together as a bloc and negotiating as one. And that seems to be that's a theme that we're definitely going to pick up more on in coming articles in Devex. I know we have some pieces coming up looking at kind of this issue of how Africa works together and negotiates from a position of strength. I don't know, Nazra, whether you've seen that kind of shift in that direction. Yeah.
I mean, I'm hearing a few things from my colleagues. I spent about 6 years working in East Africa, Kenya, Somalia, particularly, and so I think I'm so used to hearing the calls for better collaboration, for a more unified continent. 50 plus countries, so different, literally between East and West and North and South, and even Central. And so I think I want to see those become more action oriented, less we're gonna band together. But these dependencies have been in place for a long time, and not every country on the continent is also in the same they may not have the same political appetite, let's say. But I thought it was really interesting, the summary that I read from the president of South Africa in his comments coming back from BRICS, just to already echo not just continental coordination, but really brotherhood, sisterhood among the global South. In part because they need to have political power to negotiate with G7. And so I thought, okay, perhaps there's just a roadmap here. And perhaps the approaches are going to force some new models of collaboration, perhaps because things are so desperate. So I hear a lot of talk around sovereignty, but I can't wait to actually see some of that be active in the global market. At the same time, I think, Anna, you said it well, higher taxation at the domestic level doesn't always get the best response from citizens. I hear friends and colleagues who are in Kenya, we're seeing the protests there. And so I just think that there's just going to be a pretty rough terrain over the next few years. David, you're in London. I do remember when it's so hard to remember when the pandemic was, but do you remember when DFID transitioned into FCDO, or at least it was materialized that it was going to? I mean, some of the audits that I read from UK civil society was even the timeline to merge and to bring foreign affairs and international development together, that didn't always work out, and it may have reduced the budget, but it ended up being so ineffective, and it really took the priority off poverty reduction and collaboration. So wary to see how new collaboration or disassemblement happens across the
Yeah,
world.
this is the thing that I think we saw very strongly in Jess's article, was that we've really diluted the focus on and this is another question that I think we want to get into as well, is what is development anyway, right? We've started to pour more and more things into this development bucket. It used to be that it was humanitarian. Well, humanitarian was a little bit separate, but we knew that humanitarian was something that we wanted to work on. We knew that it was education. We knew that it was food. We knew that it was healthcare. And then we started to talk about all sorts of other things, which are very, very worthy and important. We started to talk about climate. We started to want to throw that in there. We started to work a lot on migration, which arguably maybe is not something that we should ever have included in development spending. And that we're diluting it with more and more and more and more things. And we kind of lost the focus on helping poor people become richer.
Yeah.
And I think, Anna, you raised this idea of pooled funds and this idea of kind of the idea that almost a kind of insurance scheme where everybody in the world pays in and then people take out as they need. And that's effectively what happens at a national level, is that everybody pays in to a common pot of taxes, and then money is doled out to people as they require it. And it just seemed to me, yes, very difficult to implement, particularly in the current political climate, but something that actually would be a much more effective way of using the United Nations and using donations and whatever. That this was an idea that I know was proposed a few years ago, specifically with migration, that rather than everybody looking after the refugees who happen to end up on their doorstep, we all paid into a refugee fund, and wherever the refugees ended up, they were funded out of that fund. And that seemed like a much more sensible and fairer way of doing it. So I think maybe
Yeah, I think it also, the intriguing aspect of it is when you have everyone paying into a fund, everyone has skin in the game, and it all of a sudden, I mean, development or humanitarian assistance always has lacked collaboration, coordination. It's been a whack-a-mole approach. So I do think it's interesting, but again, I kind of can't help but going back to my initial skepticism. Maybe it's the journalist in me of, relinquishing control is a long-standing and obvious theme in our sector of, in terms of just donors wanting to dictate how their money is used. I mean, it's whether it's a philanthropy, whether it's a bilateral donor, whether it's an MDB or IMF, for instance. But I do think, Dave, what you were saying is really intriguing on two fronts. So I think one is, I wanted to just go back real quickly to address when you mentioned Africa as a block. I think there's so much potential there, especially given the population growth of young people, the demographic boom that's going to happen on the continent. But I think what's important that Nasra pointed out is that, these are a multitude of very different countries. So I'm reminded of my own United States, 50 different states. In case you haven't noticed, we don't all get along, and you've got these different levels of, state money, state taxes, federal money. You've got regional blocks as well to some degree in the US. You've got the Midwest and so forth. So, it does beg the question, maybe, just kind of picking on the pooled funds as an example. It's great in theory, but one of these difficult ideas to execute in reality, given that you're talking about so many different streams of financing, so many different areas, countries, regions in different places of their development. So I think that has to just be kind of taken into account.
Yeah, I want to jump in there with two statistics that I thought were absolutely fascinating. One is in 1984, all but two African countries were richer than China on a GDP per capita basis. Now, or according to the most recent statistics anyway, all but two are poorer. Now, Africa and China have essentially the same population level, but the growth has been completely different. And actually, you can look at a similar phenomenon with the European Union and the United States. Two areas with similar levels of education and development and similar sort of population sizes. But the United States has consistently grown faster than in economic terms than the European Union. Now, what's driving that? It's not hard work. It's not education, it's not intelligence, it's just coordination, organization, the ability to speak with one voice and to make your presence felt in the world is what's driving that difference. And I think we're seeing a powerful argument for unity here, which unfortunately I don't think is instinctive to human beings. I think getting on the same page as other people is very, very hard work. So that's one statistic. The other statistic that I love is that if you offer a non-profit $500,000 of unrestricted funding or $1 million of funding that has to be spent as the donor requires, in about half the cases, the non-profit will take the $500,000. That's how much more effective it is when the person who gets the money decides how it's spent rather than the person who's giving the money. You can effectively double the effectiveness of your cash by just saying to the person you're giving it to, you're the expert, you figure it out. And I think that's really interesting. If we think we're the experts, we should fix the problem. If we think somebody else is the expert, we should give them the money and let them fix the problem and get the hell out of their way. So, I don't know whether either of you wants to respond to that, or maybe we can. Any love?
Well, maybe, yeah. What's coming up to my mind, and it's really funny. It's just more from my own family. If I'll say if the only issue we had was money, I think we would have solved a lot of the global crises and challenges we have. But I think it's always what's underlining, perhaps deficient funding modalities. We can't collaborate. We really, even among the NGOs, I've led a coalition of 100 NGOs. You might ask me, like, why would you do that, Nazar? Why would you do that to yourself? But it came on my docket, and I just remember for so many NGOs in one coalition with really a streamlined, flexible governance model, almost too simple. We still couldn't coordinate, and we're all focused on one country. We were all mainly physically in the same neighborhood, but we just couldn't collaborate as much as we needed to. There are incentives for competition. There are incentives for, not being okay that your sister or brother NGO also gets in. It's the reason why I felt so drawn to localization. You can look at a local partner, you can see the kind of work they're doing, you can see the risks, the inordinate amount of risks that they were taking on, and yet their big brother, big sister, INGO just wouldn't flinch. So there's something around values that I think we're going to continue to struggle until we match it with the same amount of money and getting the pooled funds, as many modalities as we can. We have to match it with the same kind of integrity and the same, at least for me, arc towards equity. If we don't solve for some of those softer things, if you will, then it may not matter actually how many pool funds we have. I also just know currently as an advisor, I can't tell you how many of my NGOs I'm praying to say, do not start a fund. Don't you dare start a fund. Like, starting a fund isn't going to solve our problem, but can you try to be a better coalition leader? Can you be part of a network? Can you coexist with other competing models? Can we combine and blend our financing? So I'm preaching to the choir, but I think Anna and some of those statistics are really, they're going to require better treatment of one another. They're going to require better principles and not just full funding.
Well, and it's also, again, I go back to, you're in a moment of crisis. There's nothing like a sense of urgency to bring people together. You're seeing it with different philanthropic foundations who generally kind of stay in their own wheelhouse. They're not, outright teaming up against President Donald Trump's, various tax proposals and things, but they are actually, this kind of a segue into the Donald Trump's recent bill, but, they advocated as a unified bloc against, provisions that would have hurt their business model. So, I do think there's nothing like this crisis to bring people together and overcome some of the self-interested differences, if you will, between and among groups. And you mentioned, Nazar, you mentioned DFID and FCDO, that the merger that happened, and now we're looking at, even the UK is cutting even more money. Mm-hmm. So that's on top of the US aid cuts. You've got other major European donors cutting. So this is truly, we always say there's a crisis, but I think this is like a really existential question for the sector, and I think it really is the start of a new era. I don't think that's, hyperbole to say. And that could very well lead to new ideas and new collaborations.
Okay, let's take that segue if we can, because we've just got a couple of minutes left, but I do want to talk a little bit about all of the legislative changes that have happened in the United States, because there's been quite a few this week and some of them are quite consequential. So, Anna, I wonder if you'd mind kind of giving us a quick précis on the absolute main things.
Sure. So it's called the Big Beautiful Bill, BBB. It's mostly a domestic focused mega bill, I would call it, with trillions of dollars in tax cuts, in part paid for by cuts to social spending, safety net programs like Medicaid and food assistance. But there are some components. It's a 900-page bill. There are some components that have significant impact on the development community. To me, the two biggest is remittances and philanthropic giving. On remittances, basically the U.S. is going to tax remittance giving from the U.S. 1%. That's for everybody. This money, remittances, money sent home from migrants back home to friends, family, is absolutely critical to development. And as we've pointed out in a ton of articles, it far outstrips ODA. It makes up huge chunks of certain countries' entire GDP. So, even a 1% tax can have enormous impacts. Originally it was supposed to be, I think, 5%. Then it was supposed to be 3.5. So in a way, it's not as bad as it could be. It was also only supposed to be toward non-US citizens, kind of as a way to, I think, kind of go toward undocumented migrants. But now it applies to everybody, citizen and non-US citizen. So, the impact of that was blunted a bit, but we're still talking remittances is going to be a huge issue. And then real quickly on charitable giving, the main thing was this escalating tax that would be levied on foundations of different size. And the hardest hit would be these big foundations like Gates, where they would go from a tax rate of approximately 1.3.9% to 10%. So that would have had a huge impact on their giving models. That was ultimately stripped out, and there is no excise tax on philanthropy. So the sector considers that a pretty major win, because now everyone is looking toward philanthropies to help fill the gap of ODA. So on the one hand, that's a win, but on the other, people are looking to remittances to help fill that gap as well. And now you're going to be charged more money from the U.S., which is a huge source of remittances. So that is an issue.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know in my entire life. My family and I came to the U.S. in the early 1990s. I don't remember this kind of, it's not just a legislative control, but attack. Let's just call it a direct attack on people who have fled countries, who've made America their second home, if not their first home. And, it's you're either deporting people who we call non-citizens or come up with all kinds of names due to the humanitarian conditions they find themselves in, who've having to flee. And they're not just kidnapped, they're disappeared. That is a term I learned from a friend of mine named Sana Mustafa, whose father was disappeared by a particular regime in Syria. And so, we have to call some of these things what they are. But now this attack on people like me who are considered naturalized citizens, who have families on both sides to support. So to even 1%, it means somebody's not eating, somebody's not going to school, somebody who I care about within my family is in peril. And so all of it for me is just an attack on citizens, an attack on human support, genuine mutual support of humans. And so if they're coming for some of us who were not born in the country or who have families in more than one place, I think it's a telltale sign that there is more harm to be done around safety nets for all. It's hard for me to say BBB. It sounds cute. It sounds adorable when you say that, but no, this is a devastating toll on our families who are unable, like philanthropic funders or philanthropic organizations, protect themselves. I remember, and I'll keep this to my last comment on this one. I remember when I used to discuss with my UN colleagues when we were either in Somalia or talking about some of the humanitarian crises, places where famine or droughts had always visited them, that would always say the best way to describe some of these things is the protection issue. You can't just call for material support. Sometimes you have to just call it what it is. And I think in the US, it is a protection issue. We are seeing devastating legal tools be used to harm people. And I really hope that we fight back.
Yeah, I don't think there's much doubt that this is a regime that it's nailed its colours to the mast here. We all understand where we are, that this is a situation in which the United States has kind of said it doesn't want to participate in this kind of international situation. And therefore other countries, to some extent, you can see kind of some African leaders looking at each other with almost a sense of relief. Well, we know where we are now. You don't like us. We always suspected maybe you didn't like us, but now we know. Right. Okay. We can do business with that. We understand where we are. We don't like you. You don't like us.
We see you for who you are.
But I don't think it. I think that it's obviously very, very problematic. And in the short term, the financial costs will be considerable here. The United people are sending tens of billions from the United States to other countries in remittances, and so a 1% tax is going to, first of all, take away hundreds of millions of dollars directly, but also it's going to disincentivize giving over borders. It's interesting that they've made it everybody. I suspect that was probably an implementation issue, that they wanted to just tax foreigners, but the money, the wire companies said we're not asking people for a passport before we take their money. It's not practical to do that. We're not doing your work. We're not the immigration authorities. And everybody would have got around it anyway by just getting their friends and family who were citizens to send it. So it's interesting to see that change. It's I feel like Donald Trump is an excellent communicator despite all of this, to get us to call it the big beautiful bill when it's clearly not beautiful at all. It's quite a lot.
Everyone. Depends on your perspective, obviously.
Right.
Yeah.
Is a tremendous success story there, really. And it's looking at it feels like this was a terrible bill for the development sector, and it's gradually turned into merely a bad one. And it's hard to know whether to count that as a success or a failure, really, at the end of the day. It's kind of somewhere in between.
It's hard to, when you say it could have been worse, does that count as success? And again, I mean, going to Nazar's point of, 1% means fewer people going to school. I mean, there was a statistic we cited in an article in Mexico alone, the loss of remittances is going to be 30 times larger than the loss of the collapse of US aid. So that just gives you a sense of scale of, the ongoing ripple effects that all of this is going to have, that the US isolationist foreign policy will have.
And a point of, a point of caution. As a student of history, I know the power of framing, and I know, political language when I see it, particularly one that works on people's fear and works to unite people around values that are about harm, that are about hurting and blaming someone else for failures of a nation, and ultimately to distract people. And so I truly, I parse my lips. I don't want to say what is untrue. That is neither, it may be big, but it's not beautiful and it's not right. And I think, I'm one of many, 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 many people who are not just struggling with the current crisis. I'm in Thailand because I just needed to get away. I just needed to find a footing and, really, truly, as a person, as a leader, as part of a family and a community, ground myself in the values that I know that me and my ancestors have always held on to. A commitment towards justice, a commitment to unify around the right things, and a commitment to fight and hold those to account. I'm still a voting citizen up until now. You never really know. And so I want to also caution us to not repeat as media, as responsible media, to not just repeat something because that's what they're calling it, but to truly ground it in what it is. It's a devastating legal tool used against communities that are more vulnerable than others, and we can choose better words. And I am somebody who loves an organization called Policy Link, but I love what they've done over the last few years, which is to redefine all of us. I know I was a USAID intern when I was in my 20s. I love being part of public service. I'm still going to be part of public service, even if the agency that I loved and critiqued is no longer here. I'm still going to be somebody who is interested in the public support and protection of people. But as Michael said, the head of Policy Link, find your new identities not in the agencies that have come and gone, but in who we are, in our ideals, and call yourself a founder. So I'm now, one of many, many founders who are now responsible to take us out of this dark hole, but also to be present and to be visible and to be on the front line and to not borrow words from somebody who I do not trust, but to ground myself in equity and say, we will fight the good fight. We have to be present. If I was a diplomat, now I'm a founder that is committed to the reshaping of this nation of mine.
Okay. Well, that seems like an excellent set of words on which to wrap up this particular podcast. So I think we will call it a show just there. Nazra, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks as well to you, Anna,
David.
for
Thank you.
coming along. Yeah. And to all of our listeners, we wish you all the best. Thanks so much.
Take care.